Hello, my name is Pippa Rowcliffe. I am the Executive Director of Monitoring at the Representative for Children and Youth Office. I'm located in Victoria, and it's a total pleasure to be joining you up there in the beautiful north. I first want to open in a good way and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Lekwungen people. And specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, and my gratitude to them for the beautiful land that I'm joining you from. I'm just giving a brief introduction to a presentation that we want to share with you that was given by Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, the representative for Children and Youth of BC. It was first recorded and delivered at Simon Fraser University this January. And in it, she details a recent report that was produced by the RCY documenting the impact of the pandemic on children and youth with special needs and their families. In the presentation, she's going to outline the broad challenges that are experienced by families and children and youth with special needs, some of our most vulnerable children and youth. She also shines a light on concerns that have been consistent and enduring over many years, and that reflect the importance of us beginning to think clearly about the experiences of these children, youth, and families, and the importance of us actually considering a more effective strategic response to their needs. The presentation will highlight in particular a couple of important themes. The first is the existing inequity in services and supports that we've seen over many years, but the really obvious effect of the pandemic in exacerbating those support and service gaps and fragmentation. So without further ado, I'm going to allow Jennifer Charlesworth to speak, and I will close the presentation once she's finished.
So I'm going to speak briefly about our report, Left Out, Children and Youth with Special Needs in the Pandemic. And just as a way of beginning in a good way, I am joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Saanich people, just north of Victoria, and grateful to the keepers of this land over many generations for us to be able to do our work. So we are fundamentally a rights-based organization. And we draw on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And when we take a look at our call to action around rights, equity, and inclusion, we see that there's a tremendous inequity experienced by children and youth living with special needs, and particularly so exacerbated within the pandemic. So one of the things we did right out of the gate was we started to pay attention to our advocacy calls and our critical injury and death reviews. We received thousands and thousands of those over the course of a year. And we wanted to see what are the patterns, what's emerging during this pandemic, this time of the pandemic, and what are some of the things that we feel is important for government to be aware of and decision makers to be aware of the impact of this pandemic. And as Vanessa said, when she's reflecting on reading the open-ended comments on the surveys, when we started to delve into our advocacy work and started to ask families and community partners what was going on, it was, I mean, I live with this every day, the kinds of challenges that families face, but I was unprepared for the depth of challenge that families are experiencing right now. And have been experiencing through the pandemic. So what we decided to do was essentially use our capacity to convene and to host and to amplify the voices of those who know best. So we reached out to our community partners. I want to acknowledge the tremendous investment that our partners made to our process and to the families who stepped up to share their stories. So we collaborated together, we worked over the summer and into the fall and started to understand and talk about what people were noticing through their various vantage points and what the surveys were showing us. And of course, we realized that this was a fundamental issue that we needed to address. But what I think really came clear very on in our work was that we couldn't talk about the pandemic's impact without talking about the context of the child and youth with special needs system. It's outdated, it's inequitable, And it's an arbitrary system of services that existed for a very, very long period of time. So what we did was we tracked, we asked questions, we had the gatherings, and we did the interviews. And what that led us to was 5 revelations from the pandemic, that it has amplified the pre-existing inadequacies of the child and youth with special needs system. It's worsened the gaps, shortfalls, and failures of that system. And there were incidences when we started to take a look at the things really haven't changed in 30 years. I was a part of the deinstitutionalization movement and created community-based resources with the promise and the excitement of it being a very different experience for families. And it's heartbreaking to see the ways in which the system has not evolved with the growing knowledge and brightness of the possibilities. So it's amplified the inequities. The lack of equitable access to services and supports has failed our commitment to human rights. We also felt that it was we felt that there was a lack of communication, and that we felt that it was very important that the government take a look at what has to be more transparent and to be consistent and fair across the province. And we felt that that was lacking, and the revelation really was that we needed a transparent and consistent plan to ensure that families were able to access those services and supports and benefits within these extraordinary times. We also learned that there was a tremendous need for flexibility, and Vanessa and Grace have spoken to that families felt that there was a lack of flexibility, and there was a rigidity that prevented them from accessing services in this very extraordinary time. And where flexibility had been enhanced, it made a difference. So we could learn from the positive things that did happen in some cases. And what we felt, the other revelation was that our inability to address and create a needs-based system of supports for families is causing long-term harm, and there were tremendous inequities based on diagnoses as well. So based on those revelations, none of them I'm sure are new to any of you that are on this call, we felt it was important to amplify again the kinds of action that was necessary. And I should just say, we had released a report a year in advance of this called Alone and Afraid. It was Lessons from the Ordeal of a Child with Special Needs and His Family. And we made the same points then, and we identified a number of recommendations at that point, and felt that, and that was from the lens of a family that reflected a much bigger systemic problem. And we felt that there had been insufficient action taken on that. So what we felt was important was to speak to a call to action. We felt we had learned tremendous amount from the community partners, from those with the lived expertise who walk alongside families, family networks. And we said to government, immediately re-engage with the community partners on the design, development, and implementation strategy for the new Child, Youth, and Special Needs framework. That was our call to action. We also identified a number of areas that we thought needed specific attention. The absence of a needs-based assessment process, and the ways in which eligibility was very restricted to access services and support. We also felt that there was this, if ever there is a time to think about income security for families and providing guaranteed basic income for families, this was the time. And there were some really important lessons through the pandemic with respect to families that found that there was a benefit to them of having the CERB funding. So that led us down that direction. We felt that there were significant inequities, and that was discriminatory, and that needed to be addressed. The delays in diagnosis and assessment, despite our Alone and Afraid report, the delays even before the pandemic had increased. So during the pandemic, of course, it became worse. That needs to be addressed. We felt the inequities in terms of the funding and access to services in some of the key programs was important to address. And as I mentioned before, the diagnosis-driven access is problematic because there are so many other ways of understanding special needs and really taking a look at functional assessment. We also felt strongly that there was a disproportionate impact on some families especially if you're low-income single parent, Indigenous, racialized, newcomers, and refugees. And that further demonstrates the lack of responsiveness to the rights of children, youth, and families. So those were areas that we identified, and again, nothing that's unfamiliar to any of you. What I can say going forward is that we continue to have conversations with the Ministry of Children and Families about their responsiveness to not only Alone and Afraid, but Left Out report, and we'll continue to pressure. This is one of our top priorities, and we will continue to layer on our work and continue to bring forward the concerns that we have. Our next report pertains to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder families, families living with that, and continuing to collaborate. One of the beautiful things about this process was finding how much synergy we could find together by bringing those various partners and recognizing that we are stronger together moving forward. So that's where we're at right now, and I will pass it back to you.
I hope you found that presentation useful, provocative, interesting, and relatable. We're going to throw a slide up at the end of this presentation that will provide you with direct links to the reports that Jennifer referred to in the presentation. So that's Alone and Afraid, and also Left Out, the stories of children and youth with special needs through the pandemic. I also wanted to note in finishing that Jennifer highlights in particular the importance of our work with this report around a collaborative approach, both with children, youth, and families, and also those who serve them and provide the kinds of supports that they need. In that spirit, I'd like to offer up that if you have an interest in being connected or being in touch with us, we would love to hear from you about your experiences and perceptions in the North. This is critical and ongoing work for us at the RCY, and so your engagement with us would be truly valued.